The rain didn't stop that morning. It came down in thin, cold needles like the sky itself couldn't stand to watch. A cheap umbrella trembled above a man's head as mud swallowed the heels of his worn shoes. The preacher said the final words, but his voice echoed off empty chairs. Not a single soul had come, except him, Ethan Miles, 42, accountant, coffee addict, emotionally unavailable, as his ex-wife liked to remind him. He stood there, hands shaking, trying to remember the last real conversation he'd had with his mother. He couldn't. It was easier to remember their fights than their laughter. No one else showed up. Not her neighbors, not her church friends, not even her bridge club ladies. Just one lonely grave and one son who didn't know whether to cry or apologize. It was supposed to be closure, but all he felt was guilt. And then, just as he was about to leave, he heard soft footsteps behind him. A woman, mid-60s maybe, dressed in dark gray, holding a small envelope, stood under the willow tree. Her face looked familiar, but Ethan couldn't place her. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother left something only for you." Ethan blinked. "What?" But before he could say more, she placed the envelope in his hand and walked away, slow, silent, like a ghost fading into rain. He stood there, confused, clutching the envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single key, old, rusted, with a tag that read one word: forgive. Forgive who? His mother? Himself? That's where it started. The strangest, most humbling journey of Ethan's life. A path that would drag him through old wounds, dusty secrets, and the kind of redemption you don't find in any inheritance. You see, this wasn't just a funeral. It was a reckoning, and if you think you know how it ends, trust me, you don't, because that simple word on a rusty key, it would unlock far more than a door. It would unlock everything Ethan thought he knew about love, loss, and his mother's truth. So grab your coffee, take a seat. This one's going to hurt a little, but it'll heal too. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. Before that rain-soaked funeral, before the lonely grave and the whisper that changed everything, Ethan Miles had lived a life built on numbers, not emotions. He was the kind of man who kept receipts from 5 years ago but couldn't remember the last time he told anyone, "I love you." His life was tidy, predictable, painfully practical, like a spreadsheet with no color formatting. But it hadn't always been that way. There was a time when Ethan believed in dreams. When he was a boy, his mother, Margaret Miles, used to call him her brilliant little professor. She'd tape his drawings of spaceships on the fridge, even when the ink smudged and the paper curled from spilled juice. She'd tell everyone in the neighborhood that her boy would do something great one day, and she meant it. Margaret herself had once dreamed, too. She grew up in a small Ohio town, the kind with one grocery store and gossip that traveled faster than wind. Her father was a mechanic. Her mother cleaned houses. Money was tight, but pride was tighter. Margaret was smart, top of her class, and she wanted to be a teacher. She loved books, especially the smell of old libraries, where silence felt sacred. But life has a cruel way of interrupting people who dream quietly. Just before her senior year, her mother fell ill, lung cancer stage 4. Hospitals, bills, late-night prayers that went unanswered. Margaret left school to take care of her. After the funeral, she promised herself she'd go back and finish. But promises made to yourself are the easiest ones to break when survival enters the picture. She started working as a cashier at a grocery store. That's where she met Daniel Miles, Ethan's father. He was charming, quick-witted, and had a smile that made you believe he had everything under control. Within a year, they were married. Within 2, Ethan was born. Then came the unraveling. Daniel had a habit of chasing shortcuts, get-rich-quick schemes, investments that never existed, jobs that started strong and ended with excuses. Margaret covered for him like most women do when love feels like duty wrapped in denial. Bills piled up. Rent bounced. Ethan's clothes came from thrift stores, and dinners often meant pancakes because flour and eggs could stretch farther than groceries. When Ethan turned 10, Daniel left. No note, no explanation, just an empty closet and a voicemail saying he needed to find himself. Margaret didn't cry that day. She just put on her apron and went to work. She took 2 jobs, one at a diner, one cleaning offices at night. Sleep became a luxury. Her hands were always cracked from bleach, her back aching from bending over trash cans that weren't hers. But she kept moving, because Ethan needed her to. There were nights she'd come home past midnight, shoes soaked, uniform stained, and still check his homework. She'd leave post-it notes on his lunchbox that said things like, "You're smarter than this world," or "Keep going, kiddo." But Ethan didn't see sacrifice. Kids rarely do. He saw distance, tiredness. He saw a mom who was never there for school plays, who forgot parent-teacher meetings, who once missed his 13th birthday because she picked up an extra shift. He didn't understand that those shifts were keeping the lights on. By the time Ethan hit college, he couldn't wait to leave. He got a scholarship, packed his bags, and promised to visit. He didn't, not really. Maybe a call once every few weeks, then months. The guilt didn't hit until years later. After his own divorce, after his own loneliness began to look a lot like hers. Meanwhile, Margaret aged quietly. Her dreams had long been folded into grocery lists and late utility bills. She kept a small box under her bed. Inside were her old teaching certificates, a few faded letters from Ethan, and one Polaroid of him holding his high school diploma. That was her treasure chest. She worked until her body wouldn't let her. Arthritis in her knees, heart murmurs, pills she could barely afford. She never complained. When neighbors asked about her son, she'd smile and say, "He's busy doing great things." Maybe she believed it. Maybe she just needed to. But behind closed doors, she'd sit at the edge of her bed, staring at the phone that rarely rang. She'd whisper the same prayer every night. "God, let him know I tried." The last winter before she died, she fell in her kitchen. No one found her for hours. The hospital called Ethan, but he was on a work trip. By the time he arrived, she was already gone. Heart failure, they said. Peaceful, they said. But there's nothing peaceful about unfinished goodbyes. And now, standing at that lonely funeral with rain soaking through his jacket, Ethan realized something he'd never dared admit. He had become everything she'd feared. Cold, distant, too proud to love the way she did. That envelope, that single word, forgive, wasn't just a message. It was an invitation to face the past he'd run from, and a mother whose sacrifices he had never really seen. But forgiveness, like grief, has layers. And what that old key would unlock next was something no son could ever prepare for. The key sat on Ethan's kitchen table for days. Old, rusted, insignificant, except for that one haunting word scratched into its metal tag. Forgive. He told himself it was nothing. Probably sentimental, maybe to a storage unit or some forgotten drawer. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. His mother had been many things. Quiet, stubborn, endlessly practical, but never sentimental without purpose. On the 5th day, curiosity won. He noticed a small return address written on the corner of the envelope the woman had given him at the funeral. It wasn't a name, just a number. Locker 114B, Willow Creek Storage. He almost laughed. Of course, she'd kept a storage unit. His mother, the woman who could stretch a can of soup for 3 meals, paying monthly for a locker, it didn't make sense. Still, that weekend, Ethan drove out to the address. The place was as depressing as you'd expect. Gray concrete, flickering fluorescent lights, and a clerk who looked like he hadn't smiled since the 90s. When Ethan slid the key into the lock, it turned smoothly, like it had been waiting for him. The metal door groaned upward, revealing, not much, a few boxes, a small wooden chest, and on top, a shoebox labeled in his mother's familiar cursive, "For Ethan, when I'm gone." He froze. For a long time, he couldn't even touch it. Something about the neat handwriting made his throat tighten. Finally, he opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each one dated, folded, and numbered. The first read, "You were 5 when I wrote this." The next, "You were 10. Then, your first heartbreak." Every major chapter of his life she had written through it. Letters she never sent, words she never said. He sat on the cold floor and read for hours. Through every page, he heard her voice again. Apologetic, loving, tired. Some letters were angry, some heartbroken, some proud. But one sentence kept repeating, "You'll understand someday why I stayed silent." That night, Ethan drove home in silence, the letters beside him. But when he reached the last envelope, it wasn't like the others. It wasn't dated. Just a short message written on the outside. "If you've come this far, you're ready for the truth." Inside was a single document, a property deed. It listed her name and one more, Helen Carter. Ethan frowned. Who was Helen Carter? He flipped through the attached note. In her shaky handwriting, his mother had written, "If you want to understand me, find Helen. She knows what I couldn't say." The next morning, Ethan searched the name. It took some digging, but eventually he found a nursing home 2 towns over with a resident named Helen Carter, age 84. He called, made an appointment, and drove there that afternoon. Helen was small, frail, and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who looked like she'd lived through 1,000 storms and learned to predict the next one by smell. When Ethan introduced himself, she didn't seem surprised. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly. "Your mother told me you'd be stubborn." He blinked. "You knew her?" Helen nodded, motioning to the chair beside her. "I was her landlord and her friend. But more than that, she helped me when no one else would." As she spoke, pieces of Margaret's hidden life began to emerge. Years ago, she had taken care of Helen after a fall, without pay, out of kindness. When Helen lost her savings to a crooked investor, Margaret helped her rebuild. But what stunned Ethan most was when Helen reached for a dusty file on the side table and handed it to him. "She told me to give you this if you ever came." Inside the file was a bundle of documents, bank statements, medical reports, and a letter from a law firm. It didn't make sense at first. Then he saw it. A series of transactions labeled Ethan Miles Trust Fund, withheld. He frowned. His mother had always said they were broke, that they'd had nothing. But these papers showed something else entirely. She had been sending small deposits for years, saving in secret. And then the letter at the back explained everything. When his father left, he hadn't just walked away. He had stolen Margaret's savings, the money she'd been setting aside for Ethan's college. She had reported it, but the case went nowhere. No lawyer wanted to take a poor woman's word over her husband's, so she'd done the only thing she could. Started over in silence. Every paycheck, every tip, every night shift, she saved again, little by little. She built that trust fund from nothing, but she'd never told Ethan. She wanted him to have it when she was gone, not out of pity, but to remind him what quiet strength looks like. Ethan sat frozen in that nursing home chair, the papers trembling in his hands. All those years, he'd resented her for being absent, tired, too quiet. She had been fighting a war he never saw. Helen reached out, her voice soft. "She forgave him long before you did. That's what that key means, Ethan. Forgive, not him, yourself." He didn't speak for a long time. Because how do you forgive yourself for misjudging the person who gave up everything for you? On the drive home, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the envelope, the letters, the key, the word. Forgive. The next day, he went through the rest of the storage unit. Among the boxes was one more item, a small cardboard folder labeled Miles Accounting Services. Inside were business plans, client notes, even mock-up flyers. Margaret had been trying to start a business, a bookkeeping service from home. It was never finished. The last page ended mid-sentence, as if she'd run out of time. And suddenly, Ethan understood. His mother hadn't just left him money or memories. She'd left him unfinished dreams. The key wasn't to a lock. It was to a legacy. He didn't know it yet, but that realization would change everything. Because what he did next would pull him into a fight bigger than guilt or grief, one that would force him to honor her in a way she never could. Herself. The kind of redemption that doesn't just heal one man's past. It rewrites it. Ethan had never been the kind of man to take risks. His world was made of spreadsheets, balance sheets, and numbers that obeyed rules. But the day he uncovered his mother's hidden documents, something inside him cracked open. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was fire. Margaret had been cheated, silenced, and erased. His father had stolen from her. The system had ignored her. And Ethan? He'd walked away from her, blind to her fight. But not anymore. He decided to finish what she started. That file labeled Miles Accounting Services became his new purpose. He registered the business, printed her old logo, and put her name as co-founder. It wasn't about money. It was about restoring her story, and then fate threw him one last test. 2 months later, he got a call from a corporate law firm. Ironically, the same one that had represented his father years ago. They wanted to hire Miles Accounting Services for a contract audit. The name must have caught their attention. They thought it was a big firm, not a man working from his mother's kitchen. Ethan accepted. Quietly. When he arrived at their gleaming glass tower, he saw the name Daniel Miles etched in gold on the lobby directory. His father's company. After all these years, Daniel had rebuilt himself, remarried, and rebranded his fraud as success. Ethan's hands shook as he signed in. His father didn't recognize the company name, yet. Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked the audit files. But the deeper he dug, the more familiar it all became. Forged invoices, adjusted ledgers, creative accounting tricks, the same patterns his father had used decades ago to rob his mother blind. It was all there again, hidden under corporate polish. He had two choices: walk away quietly, like his mother had to, or expose everything. He chose differently. He compiled the numbers, the proof, the fake transfers. He recreated the full paper trail. And then, on the day of the quarterly review, when executives, clients, and partners filled the conference room, he walked in with a calmness that didn't belong to his old self. The room was sleek and soulless, full of suits and expensive watches. His father sat at the head of the table, gray-haired now, but still wearing that same smug confidence Ethan remembered from childhood. Daniel looked up from his laptop. "Can I help you?" Ethan placed a folder on the table. "Yes, I'm here to present the audit results." Daniel frowned. "Excuse me? You're?" He hesitated. Then Ethan said it. "Ethan Miles, your son. A pin could have dropped in that room and made headlines." Daniel blinked, then forced a polite smile. "This is hardly the place." Ethan cut him off. "It's exactly the place." He slid open the folder. Pages spilled across the table, printouts, bank statements, transaction records. "These," he said evenly, "are falsified accounts, hidden assets, shell payments to offshore subsidiaries. And I've traced every single one to you." The CFO leaned forward. "What is this?" Ethan's voice didn't waver. "Fraud. The same kind you committed 25 years ago when you stole my mother's savings." For a moment, no one breathed. Daniel laughed nervously. "This is ridiculous." "You're bitter, that's all." Ethan tapped the papers. "The numbers don't lie, Dad. You taught me that." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Someone picked up a page and began scanning it. The CFO's expression changed. "Daniel, these transfers, they're real." Color drained from Daniel's face. Ethan stepped closer. "She forgave you, you know. Mom did, even after everything. But I won't let her legacy be built on lies." Then he dropped a USB drive on the table. "Copies have been sent to the IRS, the board, and Channel 9 News. I thought you'd appreciate the symmetry." The room fell completely silent. Every eye turned to Daniel Miles, the self-made success story, who suddenly looked very small in his leather chair. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He just gathered his mother's folder, turned to the board, and said softly, "That concludes my audit." Then he walked out. In the hallway, the weight of years seemed to lift off his shoulders. He didn't feel victorious, just free. The kind of freedom that comes when truth finally stops hiding. As the elevator doors closed, his phone buzzed. It was an email notification from a client inquiry. His first real contract under Miles Accounting Services. A new beginning, and as the elevator descended, he whispered what he wished he could have told his mother years ago. "I see you now." "Mom, I see everything. That was the day Ethan Miles stopped being a son chasing closure and became a man living her unfinished dream. Dear audience, if you're feeling this moment, don't forget to give the story a like. It really helps us reach more hearts like yours. The scandal shook the city for weeks. Daniel Miles's empire crumbled under the weight of the truth, and headlines painted him as the man who built wealth from deception. But for Ethan, it wasn't revenge that mattered, it was release. For the first time, his mother's name wasn't attached to silence or shame. It was connected to justice. When the investigation ended, the board reached out privately. They offered Ethan a partnership position, impressed by his courage and precision. But he declined. He didn't want to work in the same world that had once ignored his mother. Instead, he chose something simpler, something pure. He took his small business, Miles Accounting Services, and moved it into a bright corner office above an old bookstore. He framed one photograph on the wall, his mother smiling in her modest kitchen, holding a mug of tea. That was his reminder of what integrity looked like. Over the next year, Ethan began mentoring young accountants, especially single mothers, women who reminded him of her. He taught them not just how to balance books, but how to stand their ground. Some of them had been fired unfairly, others starting over after failed marriages. To each, he said the same thing his mother once told him as a boy: numbers tell stories. Make sure yours tell the truth. Soon, local businesses began trusting him. One by one, clients replaced the greed-driven firms that had dominated the city. His reputation wasn't built on advertising, it was built on honesty. Every month, he'd visit his mother's grave. At first, he brought flowers. Then, one spring afternoon, he brought something else: a letter from a scholarship foundation. He'd started a program in her name, the Margaret Miles Integrity Award, funding women in finance who stood for ethics over profit. He placed the letter gently beside her headstone. "You finally have your name on something that can't be stolen," he whispered. In time, the heaviness in his heart turned into peace. He no longer woke up thinking about his father or what could have been different. He began to live in the world his mother had dreamed of, a world where truth didn't need to shout to be heard. One winter evening, as snow fell outside his office window, a young woman knocked on his door. "Mr. Miles?" she asked nervously. "I heard about your foundation. I want to be an accountant too, but I can't afford the classes." Ethan smiled softly. "Then let's make sure you can." He handed her a scholarship form, signed, "For those who still believe honesty matters." When she left, he looked again at his mother's photo on the wall. She seemed to be smiling back, the kind of smile that comes from pride, not success. He turned off the lights, stepped outside, and for the first time in years, the cold didn't sting. It felt alive. The city lights shimmered like 1,000 open ledgers, each reflecting a tiny truth. Ethan realized then that redemption wasn't about winning, it was about becoming. His mother had spent her life trying to build something honest, and in his own quiet way, he finally had. He didn't need applause, wealth, or forgiveness from the man who wronged them. He had something better: continuation. Now, when people hear the name Miles, they don't think of fraud or scandal. They think of trust, transparency, and a son who turned grief into grace, and in that quiet, powerful way, Margaret Miles lived again. Thanks for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of truth, redemption, and the strength we carry from those we love.